IO9 presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 46 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hi, I'm John Joseph Adams. I'm the editor of Lightspeed and Fantasy Magazine. I'm also the editor of several anthologies, such as Wastelands and Brave New Worlds. My forthcoming books include Lightspeed Year 1, Under the Moons of Mars, New Adventures on Barsoom, and Armored.
And I'm David Barr Kirtley. I'm the author of many short stories, including Cats in Victory, a science fiction adventure story for young atheists about the things that matter most: chases, sword fights, hero worship, mistaken identity, sudden epiphanies, shattered illusions, genocide, creation myths, puppy love, the evolution debate, Clark's Law, religious zealot anthropomorphic cats, and wry allusions to Planet of the Apes and Thundercats. The story is available for free online in the June 2010 issue of Lightspeed magazine. And our guest today is evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. He came to prominence with his book The Selfish Gene, which popularized the gene-centered view of evolution and introduced the term meme. He followed that up with other books on evolutionary biology, such as The Extended Phenotype and The Blind Watchmaker. In his 2006 book The God Delusion, which has sold more than 2 million copies, he contends that a supernatural creator almost certainly does not exist. His most recent book is The Magic of Reality, a picture book illustrated by Dave McKean.
Okay, so let's get to our interview.
All right, so we're here with Richard Dawkins. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Okay, so your new book, The Magic of Reality, is a science book aimed at kids. What gave you the idea for this book, and what are you hoping to accomplish with it?
Well, science is wonderful, science is important, and so are children, so are young people, and so what could be better than write a science book for young people? But actually, it's a book for all ages.
Okay, and so, each chapter begins by presenting some of the mythological, pre-scientific...
Yes, each chapter begins as a question, like what is a rainbow, what is an earthquake, what is the sun, and then begins, as you say, with mythical answers to that, and then, having dealt with the 3 or 4 myths, proceeds to what really is the sun, what really is an earthquake, which is, of course, the scientific answer.
And so what are some examples of some of the myths that you included that are interesting?
Well, let me think. In the case of the sun, there are Aztec myths, which are quite amusing, and which unfortunately end up rather less amusing with the horrific rituals of offering sacrifices of human hearts to the sun god. And there's ancient Greek myths of the sun, ancient Egyptian myths of the sun. In the case of the rainbow, there's the legend of Utnapishtim from the Epic of Gilgamesh in ancient Sumeria, who was told by one of the gods to build an enormous boat to hold all the animals, because there was a great flood coming. And he did, and then when the flood went down, the gods put up a rainbow as a signal that they were never going to make another flood again. That may sound familiar, and it's because, of course, the story of Noah was simply a plagiarism of the Sumerian story of Utnapishtim.
I thought it was interesting. You make the point in the book that all of these ancient myths, though they were supposedly inspired by all-knowing gods, don't include anything that the peoples themselves weren't familiar with, so they make no reference to diseases being caused by microorganisms or that the universe is expanding, anything like that.
Yes, that's right. I'd forgotten I made that point, but it's quite a good point, yes. Okay, thanks for reminding me of that.
So the book is illustrated by Dave McKean. How'd you two start working together?
This was fixed up by the publishers and by our respective literary agents, and so it worked very well, and I think the pictures are very good and suit the text very well. But I didn't fix it up myself, I don't think. I can't remember. I think it was done by the publishers.
So did you focus on the text and just leave the art to Dave, or did you
Exactly. Yes, I just wrote the text, and then he took the text and pretty much chose what he wanted to illustrate.
I mean, there are some places where the text makes reference to the art. Did you add?
Of course, yes. Now, I mean, there was a certain amount of back and forth, and so when he'd done the art, then of course I modified the text to make reference to it.
I mean, speaking of sort of educating children, there's often a conflict we have between the rights of parents to direct the upbringing of their children versus the rights of children to be exposed to accurate information. I mean, how do you think that we should try to balance those two interests?
My balance would come out in favor of the children. I guess there's some rights of parents, what they choose their children to learn, but I'm biased in favor of freeing children to learn and not letting parents be too doctrinaire in indoctrinating their children.
Okay, and so creationists often try to mislead the public into thinking that there's a scientific controversy over whether evolution happens at all, which is, of course, ridiculous.
Yes, it is ridiculous.
What are some actual scientific controversies among evolutionary biologists?
There are some very interesting controversies. I mean, there's the controversy over the importance of natural selection rather than random genetic drift in guiding evolution or driving evolution. And that's an active controversy, very interesting one, plenty of data to bear upon it. I think nobody would claim that random genetic drift is capable of producing adaptation, that's to say the illusion of design. Random genetic drift can't produce wings that are good at flying or eyes that are good at seeing or legs that are good at running. But random genetic drift probably is very important in driving the evolution at the molecular genetic level. That's one controversy. Another one is the controversy over punctuated equilibrium in the fossil record, which you may have heard of. So there are very interesting controversies in evolution. But whether evolution happens at all is not one of them. It definitely does.
Is group selection, would you say that's an active controversy?
Yeah, yes, we'd have to include that. I don't think that's a very interesting controversy. I think it's largely a controversy about words. But yes, that is a controversy which you can find active scientists participating in, unlike the alleged controversy over whether evolution happens at all, where no active scientist thinks that it doesn't.
What do you think about the issue of whether homosexuality is biological, and how would natural selection account for that or be involved with that?
Superficially, it's a problem if it is genetic, if the difference between people's sexual preferences is genetic, because at least a pure homosexual would be unlikely to reproduce and therefore pass on the genes. So the first question to ask is it actually genetic? And the answer is probably to some extent yes. There's some evidence from twin studies comparing monozygotic twins who have exactly the same genes pretty much with dizygotic twins who don't. And because homosexuality is one of the many things which is more highly correlated between monozygotic than dizygotic twins, we probably have to conclude that there is a genetic component. And that means that we have a Darwinian problem to explain why male homosexuality, for example, seems to be about 10%, if that's too high to be easily explained. Various explanations have been offered. There's the worker bee theory, that gay men look after not their children, but their nephews and nieces, etc. There's the sneaky male theory that apparently homosexual males are often actually bisexual, and the fact that they appear to be homosexual leads dominant males in our cavemen ancestors, so to speak, to leave them behind when they went off, leave the women in their charge. And this would have been a possible way in which genes that make men appear to be homosexual could get passed on by sneakily, so to speak, mating with females when the dominant males are away. I'm not that wedded to either of those two theories. I rather like the idea that when we talk about genes for anything, like a gene for being gay or a gene for being aggressive or something of that sort, a gene for anything may not have been a gene for that thing under different environmental conditions. And the hypothetical example that I've used for that is, suppose that there's a gene that makes you gay if you were bottle fed, but has some completely different effect if you were breastfed. So in the days before bottles were invented, that gene would not have manifested itself as gay behavior. But now that bottles are common, it can do so. I hasten to stress that I only use the idea of bottle feeding as a possible example, and absolutely no evidence that that is an environmental trigger for this particular gene. But there could be a trigger of some sort from the environment, in which case we would be asking the wrong question if we say, why do gay genes survive? Because it may be that at the time when natural selection was really going on, there was no such thing as a gay gene.
So what are some recent developments in evolutionary biology that you're the most excited about?
Well, there's a perennial problem of what's the use of sex, and that is still unsolved. I'm very excited by molecular evolutionary studies and the use of molecular genetics to reconstruct possible ancestral trees, work out how long ago the common ancestor lived of any two species you care to name, like, say, humans and chimpanzees. And molecular data suggests that the common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees lived rather recently, only about 6 million years ago. And you can do similar molecular analyses to work out how long ago the common ancestor of any other pair of species lived. So I'm very excited about that. Molecular genetics can also show up some rather surprising relationships, like, for example, the close relationship of whales to hippopotamuses, which I think nobody ever guessed until the molecular data was looked at. And the closest relatives of whales are hippopotamuses, and even closer than any other cloven-hoofed animals. So it's not that whales and all the cloven-hoofed animals are sort of distant cousins. It's that whales come off actually within the cloven-hoofed animals. They are closer to hippos than to anything else. And that's a very remarkable finding, which has come about purely since the molecular genetics revolution. And there are lots more like that. There are projects to analyze the genome of extinct animals like mammoths and like Neanderthal people. And I find them very exciting as well.
Could you elaborate a bit on the what is sex good for issue? I mean, it seems like I would think that sex is a good way for there to be genetic variety within the population for natural selection to act on.
Yes. That's fine if you think that natural selection works at the level of the population. If you think that natural selection chooses good populations versus bad populations, good groups. In other words, if you're a group selectionist, then there's not a problem. But there is a problem if you're not a group selectionist, as most evolutionists are not. And so you have to face the fact that, on the face of it, an asexual female, a female who doesn't indulge in sex and simply clones herself, is twice as successful at passing on her genes as a female who uses sex. A female who simply dispensed with males altogether would be doing better under quite a lot of conditions. And so whatever the benefit of sex is, it can't be a slight benefit. It's got to be a colossal benefit to overcome the enormous benefit of being asexual. And so that's really why it's a difficult problem and why it's been exercising the minds of evolutionary theorists for about 30 years now.
Okay. I mean, since our show is called Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, obviously we're big Douglas Adams fans. Now, you knew Douglas Adams, and he talked a lot about what a big influence your books were on his thinking. Could you just tell us, how did you first become aware of Douglas Adams, and how did the two of you first meet?
I loved his books, and I particularly was fond of Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. And I think it's the only book where I've read it and then immediately turned straight back to page 1 and started again and read it all the way through again without a break. And I then wrote him a fan letter. I think it's the only fan letter I've ever written. And then he wrote me a fan letter back, which was very nice, and invited me to visit him next time I went to London, and I did. And I remember ringing the bell in his house in North London, and this gigantic man coming to the door. I mean, he wasn't fat; he was tall. Well built, but tall, and clearly amused at the reaction that one's first sight of him had on people, because he knew that his height was rather striking, but he just sort of gently laughing, and we hit it off immediately, and quite frequently met after that. I used to use him as my sort of guru on technological questions, and he and I both love the Apple Macintosh, and so every time a new Mac came out or a new gadget came out that you could run on a Mac, we would sort of exchange notes on it, and he would tell me what it could do and things like that.
So I understand he actually introduced you to your wife, Lala Ward.
Yes,
how'd that come about?
Yes, that is true. He knew her through a different route. He knew her because he had been scriptwriter for Doctor Who at one stage in that series. Any Doctor Who script which is witty, not all witty, but if you come across one that's witty, it's almost certainly going to be one of Douglas Adams's. He injected a wonderful sort of surreal wit into the Doctor Who scripts. Anyway, he wrote the script while she was playing the companion, and so he knew her through that. And Lala and I met at I think it was his 40th birthday party, and we were introduced to. Let me think. That's right. We were introduced to each other by Douglas, who was at that time talking to Stephen Fry, who was another immensely tall man. And so Lala and I, as it were, conversed underneath this archway, which was Douglas Adams and Stephen Fry sort of talking over our heads. And so Lala and I talked through this archway for a bit, and then the party was so incredibly noisy we couldn't hear ourselves speak, and so we simply left the party and went off and had dinner. We've pretty much been together ever since.
See, on YouTube, I came across this video where it's from a TV program where you invited a volunteer from the audience to read a section of Hitchhiker's Guide, and then it turns out that Douglas Adams is sitting in the crowd, and he comes up and reads a section about the animals who want to be eaten.
Well, you didn't really believe that it just turned out that way.
Oh, no.
Yes, that was quite a nice little episode, because it's supposed to be children who come up when you call for volunteers, obviously. And so I sort of said in my best sort of avuncular voice, would anybody like to come up and help me with this next experiment? Well, not whatever it was, with reading this passage from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And so a great forest of hands shot up, little hands, plus one very big hand, which was Douglas. And so I called him out, and this enormous man came to the front and read this lovely passage from The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, where the animal that's been bred to be eaten and to enjoy, to want to be eaten. It's a very, very typically Douglas thing, a lovely flight of, fancy, but also flight of intelligent thought.
Was that just a one-time thing, or did the two of you do any other public appearances together?
Yes, we did, as a matter of fact. We appeared together at a literary festival. All over Britain, there are a number of literary festivals. I forget which one this was. It might have been Cheltenham. And we appeared on the stage together. I think he was kind of interviewing me about whatever was my current latest book. I forget which one that was. But it went very well, and I don't know if there's a recording of it. I'd love to think that there was. If you've got good sleuthing skills to find it on YouTube, I'd love to know.
So besides Douglas Adams, would you consider yourself a science fiction fan? And if so, who are some of your favorite authors?
I couldn't really, because I haven't read enough. I'm not one of those people who reads these science fiction magazines like Astounding Science Fiction and so on. I've read a fair number, not that many, science fiction books by a fairly limited number of authors. Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle, the famous astronomer, the great astrophysicist, who invented the steady-state theory of the universe and was a very a very distinguished physicist who should have won the Nobel Prize, actually, but didn't because he was such an impossible character. But Fred Hoyle wrote quite a lot of science fiction, most of which is not very good. It's sort of potboiler stuff, but the first one, The Black Cloud, is excellent. And a couple of others that he wrote on Andromeda, A for Andromeda and Andromeda Breakthrough. Those three books by Fred Hoyle are very good and among the best science fiction I've read, mainly because they actually teach a lot of science. I actually learned a lot of science from his science fiction books. And I wrote a foreword to a reprinting of The Black Cloud, or maybe it was an audio edition. I think it was an audio edition of The Black Cloud. And so I put down a list of the science that I had learned from it. I'm very fond of an author called Daniel Galloy, who I don't think he's written all that many books, but I've read 3 of them, and they're all very good. John Wyndham. I can't think of very many more.
Okay, so I've heard you say that you might actually want to write science fiction yourself someday. Is that something you're still considering?
I haven't thought very seriously about it. Occasionally I wonder if I might, but I don't have a plot in mind.
I heard you say at one point that you liked this idea that if you were to trace your ancestry back, at each stage the people would be able to reproduce with each other, but people if you get far enough apart, the people can't reproduce with each other, and that you might want to do a science fiction novel involving that somehow. I
don't remember saying that. That idea is certainly prominent in The Magic of Reality. It dominates the chapter 2 of The Magic of Reality. I didn't remember that I thought of doing a science fiction story along those lines. I suppose you could, yes. But I mean, once you've said the plot, you've said it really. I'm not sure what you could do with it in the way of fiction. I think the other plot that I had thought of, which actually you might be able to do something with, is hybridizing humans and chimps. Because that's borderline possible. I mean, it's never been done yet, but it's not totally ridiculous to think about that. Or making since we now have both the human genome and the chimp genome in toto, you could theoretically concoct a kind of halfway stage between them, which you could either think of it as being a reconstruction of the common ancestor of humans and chimps, which lived 6 million years ago, or I suppose you could think of it as what you might get if you hybridized it. Now, if you were to make that genome, that halfway house genome, and clone an individual from it, there I think you do have the makings of a science fiction story, because that would raise all sorts of problems, ethical problems in people's minds, social problems. And so you could use your fiction story to explore what might happen. I mean, the religious types would freak out totally, and many people would think it was a very immoral thing to do. You could explore the problems that the hybrid individual, the halfway house individual, might have fitting into human society or indeed chimp society. So I think you could make a science fiction story about that.
When you say talk about hybridizing humans and chimps, are you talking about doing genetic engineering or actually just mating humans and chimps?
Well, I mean, in a fiction story, you could do either of those, and I'm not sure which would make the best fiction story. Perhaps literally breeding them together, because that would engender an additional kind of frisson of yuck factor in people's minds. But the genetic engineering route might be more scientifically interesting.
But humans and chimps are actually genetically closely enough related that you actually could produce.
No, I'm not saying that, and I suspect they're probably not close enough that you could actually mate them and breed in the ordinary way. but they're not so far that it would be a ridiculous plot in a science fiction story. I mean, it would be less ridiculous, for example, than the plot of Jurassic Park, which I rather like. I mean, I rather like the idea of getting blood out of mosquitoes in amber, and that's very ingenious. But I think that is actually less plausible than the hypothetical plot of mating a human and a chimpanzee and getting fertile offspring.
What actually is implausible about the Jurassic Park mosquito thing?
Oh, that DNA doesn't survive that long.
Mm.
I mean, we're talking 65 million years, and DNA doesn't survive that long. I mean, even if it did, it would then be a very difficult problem to grow the dinosaur. But I mean, it's a reasonable science fiction plot. It falls within the sort of brackets of what I would think make for good science fiction, as opposed to pure mystery fantasy, which I don't regard as science fiction at all.
How about the thing there's this thing in Jurassic Park where they didn't have complete DNA for the dinosaurs, so they plugged in like African frog DNA or something, which enabled the dinosaurs to switch genders. Do you have any thoughts on any of that stuff?
I don't remember that detail. I wouldn't have thought frog would be the right thing to go for. Bird would be better, because birds are dinosaurs. They're just dinosaurs that never went extinct. In other words, birds are closer related to some dinosaurs than some dinosaurs are to others.
So your advocacy for evolution has put you at odds with some really strange characters, such as Ted Haggard and Ben Stein. Do any of those encounters stand out as the most surreal?
Well, you've seen those two on film. The Ted Haggard one was aggressive, or ended up aggressive, and I think nowadays I wouldn't play it like that. I mean, I think I've now learned that a better way is to let these people hang themselves, give them enough rope to hang themselves, rather than argue with them. In the case of Ben Stein, I didn't know I was arguing with him at all. I mean, I wasn't told this was a creationist front. The producer, a deeply dishonest man of the name of Mathis, I mean, a real slimeball, led me, and various other people like P.Z. Myers and Michael Roos and others, led us all to believe that we were taking part in a serious science program. And in conversation with me, Mathis even led me to believe that he was an anti-creationist. So when I met Ben, I'd never heard of Ben Stein, and this rather unpleasant man came into the room, and I wasn't aware that he was unpleasant. I wasn't aware that he was a creationist, and I started answering his questions in good faith, and only sort of very gradually tumbled to the fact that this interview was not what it had been what it had been cracked up to be. But I still treated his questions honestly. And so, for example, when he asked me whether I could, under any circumstances at all, think of how life on Earth could have been intelligently designed, or could there ever be life that was intelligently designed, I bent over backwards to think, well, can I think of an extreme condition in which it might be intelligently designed? And I thought of Francis Crick's tongue-in-cheek suggestion that life on Earth had been seeded by directed panspermia, by some extraterrestrial intelligence seeding the Earth with bacterial life. And this sort of bending over backwards to think of a way in which intelligent life might, under some circumstances, what's the best case I could make for intelligent life, was seized upon. Dawkins believes in little green men. And this was a thoroughly dishonest tactic, which, I mean, now, if anybody is listening who is ever invited to make a film by this man Mathis, he's dishonest. Don't do it.
The sort of run-ins with Haggard and Stein, were those the sort of most obnoxious people that you've come face-to-face with, or are there things that aren't on tape that were worse?
You've seen the film of The Magic of Reality, but probably the most obnoxious of all was, there were several, quite a lot of competition, actually. I mean, there was a former Jew turned Muslim have you seen that one? I've forgotten his name, but he was a real case. He's actually quite nice when he wasn't on camera, but as soon as he was making his case for his fanatical brand of Islam, he just became really, really violent in his language, saying, what a great guy Hitler was and things like that. And then there was another one who ran a show called Hell House, somewhere in California. It's a house where children of 12, are taken to be shown in little acted-out tableaus what a horrible place hell is, and how you'll go to hell if you do each of various appalling things. And these are really horrific acted tableaus designed to scare the daylights out of children. And I thought he was obnoxious, and certainly what he did was obnoxious.
So speaking of really strange characters, I gather from your recent op-ed in the Washington Post that you're not a big fan of this year's crop of Republican presidential contenders.
Is anyone that you know? I mean, no, of course not. These people are know-nothings, and it would be a tragedy if any of them was elected. No serious scientist or nobody even of any education at all takes creationism seriously. It's almost as though the American electorate is splitting into two species. I mean, the sort of the civilized, educated ones on the one hand, and the total ignorant know-nothings on the other hand. And it's terribly sad that a large number of voters seem prepared to vote for somebody because he's like them, rather than because they think he's actually qualified to lead the country.
So, your website has this converts corner where there are letters from readers who have abandoned religion after reading your books.
Yes.
Have any of those letters stood out as being particularly memorable?
I haven't looked at them for a while, but they're well worth reading. They're quite numerous, and many of them are very nice. A lot of people say that they weren't actually converted by reading The God Delusion, but what The God Delusion did was give them the confidence to come out, give them the confidence to actually say what they believed, rather than to kind of secretly keep it to themselves.
So you founded an organization called the Richard Dawkins Foundation. What sorts of projects has the foundation been involved with?
In America, it's actually there are two. There's one in Britain and one in America with the same name. In America, quite a lot of films, quite a lot of DVDs, videos, including things we call vignettes, which are sort of 3-minute, 5-minute little films of a scientist. It might be me, it might be somebody else, it might be me having a conversation with somebody else, trying to make one point, one little vignette point, which can then be used by teachers to sort of slot into their lessons, just to make one point. Also longer videos, which have been often conversations between me and another scientist or a philosopher or another scholar of some kind. We're trying to pioneer a sort of interview which is not really an interview. It's more of a conversation between two people, a kind of conversation between equals, or between people who have expertise in different subjects, like, say, me as a biologist and Lawrence Krauss as a physicist, where we each learn from each other. So it's a kind of mutual tutorial, trying to get away from the debate format where you have a punch-up which doesn't really illuminate. So we're trying to pioneer the mutual tutorial conversation rather than the debate punch-up.
I read richarddawkins.net all the time, and you actually post in the comments threads fairly often. I mean, how involved are you in running that site?
I'm not involved in running it. I do comment quite often, as you say, maybe once a day, twice a day, and it varies. But I keep an eye on it, as you do.
I mean, you alluded to this a second ago, but you've often stressed how important it is for atheists to become politically organized and to speak up. If people want to sort of get involved with that, how should they go about it?
Well, I think that what we're going to try and do on our website is to launch a slightly more of an activism section where people can find out about what other people are trying to do in their particular local area. Not quite sure how we're going to do this, but it'll be in some form. People will be able to look in their own local area and find out what sort of activism is going on there, how they might be able to join in.
All right, so that does it for our questions. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't cover?
Well, the book, The Magic of Reality, is shortly coming out in America, and it's already out in Britain and is doing very well. It's gone straight into the Sunday Times bestseller list, which is the sort of British equivalent of the New York Times bestseller list. It's gone straight in at number 2, which is excellent news. It's not rather unusual for a book to go straight in so high on the list as that. There's an app for the iPad coming out any minute now, which is a sort of e-book version of The Magic of Reality. Only runs on the iPad. It doesn't run on the Kindle. And it's more than just an e-book because it has all the pictures for one thing, but it also has various simulations, games, animations, which illustrate points in the book to help explain things with where an animation or a movie does it better than just still pictures.
All right, great. Well, Richard Dawkins, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Thank you very much.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Richard Dawkins for joining us on the show. Okay, and so our discussion topic for today is going to be atheism and science fiction. And it's certainly something that I've noticed, that there tends to be a disproportionate number of atheists and agnostics among fantasy and science fiction readers. And I'm not the only one to have noticed this. I came across this really funny article on some sort of religious website called wayoflife.org. And this article is called Beware of Science Fiction. And like half of this article is scare quotes. I'll try to use my, with my voice indicate where they are. But so it says, science fiction takes the reader into a strange world without God. Oh, there might be a God, a force, but it is definitely not the God of the Bible. And the prominent names in this field are atheists. Take Carl Sagan, for example. His best-selling sci-fi novel Contact was made into a movie. Sagan was one of the high priests of atheistic evolution. And it goes on. It says, consider another prominent name in sci-fi, Isaac Asimov. In a 1982 interview, he said, emotionally, I am an atheist. I don't have the evidence to prove that God doesn't exist, but I so strongly suspect he doesn't that I don't want to waste my time. Consider Robert Heinlein, called, quote, the dean of science fiction writers. He rejected the Bible and promoted free sex. His book Stranger in a Strange Land is considered the unofficial Bible of the hippie movement. Heinlein was a nudist and practiced polyamory. He promoted agnosticism in his sci-fi books, and it goes on. Arthur C. Clarke, said he didn't want any religious rites associated with his funeral. Kurt Vonnegut was honorary president of the American Human Association. Gene Roddenberry, creator of Star Trek, he was an agnostic and humanist who envisioned a world in which, quote, everyone is an atheist and better for it. So it wraps up. Science fiction is intimately associated with Darwinian evolution. Sci-fi arose in the late 19th and early 20th century as a product of an evolutionary worldview that denies the almighty creator. In fact, evolution is the preeminent science fiction. Beware! Exclamation point. But, and this is only scratching the surface. I mean, you could go on and on listing fantasy and science fiction authors, who are atheists or agnostics. I mean, we talked about Douglas Adams a few episodes back. I mean, it's almost easier to mention ones who aren't. I mean, there's certainly some notable examples who aren't. I mean, Orson Scott Card comes to mind, who's a Mormon.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of Mormons, it seems like. Of the religious science fiction writers, a lot of them are Mormon.
I mean, Gene Wolfe is Catholic. And of course, Tolkien and Lewis were both really religious, although I guess Lewis had been an atheist for much of his life before he converted. But yeah, I mean, there does seem to be this big disproportionate number of atheists. I'm reminded, I was at a convention one time, and they had a panel, and the topic was, religion and science fiction, something like that. So someone said, well, how many, let's just get an idea of how many people in this room actually are religious. Just raise your hand if you go to church on any kind of regular basis. And this is an audience of, 60, 70 people, something like that. And nobody raised their hand. And then Jim McDonald, who was on the panel, says, so how many of you consider yourself to be in church right now? Mm-hmm. At a science fiction convention, people laugh and raise their hands. And that's really, that's a really striking little sort of experiment there. Because, something like 90% of the American public is religious. And so to have that many people, there's something going on there.
I'd actually be interested to see, among science fiction writers, if we did a sort of a poll of science fiction writers, which ones of them identified as being religious or atheist or whatever, where the line is for people who are primarily science fiction writers versus people who are primary fantasy writers. Because like for science fiction writers, I would think that it would be a very, very small percentage of those who are actually religious. Whereas fantasy, I can see how there would be a larger percentage of fantasy writers just because, like, in the tradition of Tolkien and Lewis, I can see how it's a lot easier to sort of draw parallels to, your religious book of choice, and do something with that in a fantasy setting. Because, from our point of view as atheists, looking at things like the Bible and whatnot, that's like a fantasy story, right? It's got all this magic and stuff in it. If you take it out of the context of religion and you say, well, hey, here's this book, and you're like, well, I don't know, it's not very well written, but I guess there's some cool magic in it and stuff, but it's not much of a story. It kind of goes all over the place, but basically it's a fantasy novel. Even though we, science fiction writers take scientific fact and sort of extrapolate and take it into, fanciful fictional directions. I think the underlying supposition of most science fiction is that it has some basis in reality, and I think that draws a lot of people who also want to have it, who also take that view in the real world, and that they believe in what they can see, what they can scientifically prove, and that kind of thing. And so I think it's just natural that that more people of that nature sort of gravitate towards science fiction. One of the things about fantasy fiction that has gods and whatnot in it, and the characters believe in the gods or don't, that, one of the things that always kind of bugs me, like once I became an atheist and like I'm firmly in that worldview, when I read those, it's like, it's really hard for me to, to enjoy characters who actually do believe in a god, even in this fantasy setting. It's a completely different situation because in that setting, the gods have actually proven themselves that they exist, right? So, it's not like faith, when you have that. I kind of like how in George Martin, like the gods that they talk about, like, they never make themselves known at any point. And so you kind of assume that, well, the characters believe in these gods, but they don't actually exist,
Well, I want to say quickly on the subject of George R.R. Martin is I think that's one of the things that's so brilliant about that series, and I don't know if that's something that I ever saw before in fantasy, because usually in fantasy any god or prophecy that's presented, you can just take it for granted that it's real, and it's going to be proven that it's real sooner or later in the story. And I think that's what's so interesting about Song of Ice and Fire is that you're never really sure what's going on with the supernatural stuff. Like, are these gods real? Are they imaginary? Is there magic and people misinterpret it as gods? Some of it's obviously there's something supernatural going on. Some of it, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. And so it feels much more like the real world where, there's a lot more doubt and uncertainty about what the cosmology is. I don't particularly have a problem with gods as characters in stories. Especially in fantasy stories. I've never particularly had a problem, say, with like the gods of Mount Olympus or something in Greek mythology, who are fantastic characters in the stories. And it doesn't sort of irk me if the characters believe in them. It does kind of irk me if there's a story which features a Judeo-Christian type God, because I just have all the same logical problems then with that fiction as I do with the religion as it's presented to me in the real world. Like, well, why doesn't the God intervene? Like, why, if the God's all powerful, why does all this bad stuff happen? If the God knew what was going to happen, why didn't he do stuff to prevent the bad stuff from happening, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, there's like all sorts of things that just don't make any sense to me at all about an all-knowing, all-powerful God. Okay, well, one thing that I wanted to talk about was, since we were talking to Richard Dawkins about evolutionary biology, this is just something that's sort of come to bug me more and more in fantasy stories, is where you have gods and demigods who have a human body. That's sort of just the more I read about evolutionary biology, the more I come to see how inevitably and inescapably everything about the human body is a product of our specific evolutionary history, or the specific gravity of this planet, the distance from the sun, the the life forms that evolved before us, the atmosphere, etc. Everything, like our eyes, our hair, our bones, everything, is a product of our specific history. And so it makes less and less, I'm less and less able to suspend my disbelief when there are godlike beings who don't share our evolutionary history, who existed before time, who come from a numinous realm, etc., who just happen to have 5 fingers, 5 toes. And it just doesn't make any sense to me. Like, why would a god, floating in light or whatever, have toenails, have a spleen, have testicles. I mean, what is this stuff for?
It's to have sex with mortals, stupid.
I mean, but no,
That's Zeus.
But I mean, I could, I'm totally cool with gods assuming human form to interact with human beings. Okay, I mean, that's cool, whatever. But just the fact that gods are just innately human in form, and when they're sitting around the fire around Mount Olympus, whatever, they actually just fundamentally are human shaped. That just bothers me more and more the more I think about it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that certainly doesn't make any sense. I mean, I think there's various ways you can get around that, and if you're creating a mythology, like you could sort of have something where, like you say, the god doesn't actually have a human form naturally. It's like he's some sort of numinous being, but can take the form of humans for when he's interacting with humans. But then you also have a situation where you can have, the gods were once human or something, and then they arose. They grew. They developed all this additional power and became gods or something like that. And I mean, it is weird though, because like in the Christian mythology, it explicitly states that humans are made in God's image, right? So God would have had this form according to the Bible, and then he made humans in his image. So that doesn't make any sense, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've had conversations with people who have tried to tell me that the plain meaning of the words means something other than what you just said. But I think that's a dodge. But
right. I mean, I could see that though too. I can see that. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of rationalizing when you interpret anything from the Bible. Like, you try to figure out, well, how does this work with what I understand of the world? But I mean, I could see that how made us in his image could mean something else other than physical form.
But it does irk me though when I have conversations with people and I just point out how silly it is to imagine God as a white man with a white beard, and they'll say, "Oh, of course that's silly," but that's not what I believe. That's not what anyone ever believed. And it's kind of like, well, come on, look at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I mean, obviously that's what people believed. For most of history, that was the image of God that people had. Well, actually, I mean, there's a tendency to just make the gods look like we want them to, and I think making them look human is part of that. But I can't remember where I read this, but there was this thing that's always really stuck with me where somebody said, if horses could invent gods, they would invent gods that look like horses, and just the idea of gods actually being human has always just seemed to me that sort of thing, that sort of just self-aggrandizing, sort of self-absorbed sort of thing. Yeah,
I mean, they actually probably look like dolphins, because they're they're the most intelligent species on this planet, right?
I mean, I've always sort of like, like the Greeks had this idea that the circle was the perfect form and stuff. I've always imagined, that gods should be just sort of like spheres of light or something, in their true form,
Yeah.
something like that.
Speaking of spheres, it's just that, that makes me think of like the planet Earth and the solar system. And it's like, and I mean, that's one of the things, that really first started making me question, like religion is when, we start learning science and you learn about the planets and you think about God and you sort of think about how God is ruling over the humans, right? But then you start learning about the solar system and you're like, well, I mean, does he also rule over every other planet in the whole universe? I mean, and obviously we've never come across any proof of alien life forms on other planets, but I mean, just even if there is no other life on other planets, doesn't it seem bizarre that there would be this whole universe out there that God would have been responsible for? But yeah, he's paying close attention to what happens on to these little ape people on Earth. Like what that's sort of one of the things that started me off questioning stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean this whole idea that the whole universe, like all of existence, was created to give us a place to live. Again, seems very self-absorbed, but somebody made the point. If the universe was created explicitly to give us a place to live, it's very strange that 99.9999999, et cetera, % of it is radioactive vacuum, which is instantly lethal to all life. It's a very sort of strange plan for creation.
Right.
That if somebody had in fact designed the universe to give us a place to live, that universe would be the way that ancient people imagined it to be. There would be like a flat Earth and some stuff in the sky to give us light and heat and so on, and there wouldn't really be much beyond that.
One thing from comics that I actually always enjoyed and sort of tied to religion in a way in my mind was the character Galactus.
Yeah.
So Galactus is this like gigantic world devouring entity, but and so he has these heralds who go out and find him planets to devour, and the Silver Surfer is one of his heralds, and that's what the Silver Surfer comic is about. So now he's gigantic. He's like bigger than planets, because he devours planets. And so as an explanation of like where this creature, this being came from, the explanation in the comics is that he was like the last survivor of the previous universe that existed before this one, and so he and he somehow escaped the destruction, the heat death of that universe, and ended up in our universe. And I always thought that was kind of cool, and like it seemed to me like there was some sort of religious implications of that. Like, I mean, it's just like I could see religious implications of that, and it's kind of funny because in the comics, like I don't remember them ever mentioning anything like that. But I always thought it was kind of cool.
But I mean, I guess you mentioned, that contemplating the scale of the universe is one thing that sort of caused you to start doubting religion. I mean, what was your sort of religious upbringing, and how did that sort of change?
Yeah, I mean, I was raised Catholic. And I actually went to Catholic school for 4 years, or maybe 5, as if you count kindergarten, but, through 4th grade. And then I started going to public school after that. When I was in Catholic school, we used to have to go to, it was interesting because, we would have to go to church on Fridays, when we were in school. So we'd go with our class, but then you're also supposed to go to church on Sunday with your family, and if this is one of those sort of ritualistic things that you end up doing when you're a part of the Catholic religion. So you go up and you get communion, but the thing was, if you didn't go to church on Sunday with your family, like you weren't allowed to go get communion on Friday with your class, because I think you have to go do confession or whatever because you didn't go to church. You have to confess and be clean or whatever before you go get communion, right? And so it was like this situation set up to ostracize you for not going to church. And the thing is, like, although my mother, had me enrolled in this Catholic school, like they never took me to church on Sunday. So it was just kind of weird right from the start when I was a kid that I was sort of being ostracized from my class, or being, held out as a sinner, basically, because my parents didn't take me to church. So I don't know. I mean, that may have had some influence on starting me off as a doubter early on, even if I didn't realize it until much later. I don't know if I could pinpoint where I actually decided that I was atheist, but I mean, there was certainly an experience I had in college that sort of helped me on the way towards becoming an atheist. And I mean, it's kind of a funny story, but I mean, I was in a creative writing class, like in my first year of college, and there was a girl that I sort of had a crush on, and so she was like in the little writing groups that we broke into. She was in my group, and I had actually written this story that was sort of questioning religion. I mean, it was about. It was like sort of takes place in a future where, like immortality is an option for everyone, and that you give, you sort of take this pill or whatever, and you can, keep living on forever, so it's about this priest who is like giving these things to the poor people, which who couldn't get it otherwise. But it was set up in this completely blasphemous way, so like the priest is like basically giving the communion rite, but giving these immortality pills to the homeless people instead. And anyway, because of that, like this girl was religious, and I think she probably saw that as a cry for help or something, whereas I just thought it was a cool idea or something, and so anyway, like I was interested in her, and I asked her out, and she, as it turns out, I mean, she basically just ended up befriending me because she wanted to save me. Because she was a born-again Christian, and which I didn't realize until afterward, But, so that sort of further soured me on the whole idea of religion, that, like she actually had no interest in me and sort of led me on, but only because she wanted to save me. And I mean, I guess it's kind of nice in a way, but, it kind of, you know what I mean? It's like, well, I appreciate it and everything, but, that's not really what I was interested in. And I mean, I know I certainly science fiction played a large part in it for me, because like I know, like I read like Robert J. Sawyer. He wrote several novels early on that sort of deal with religion in some way. Like the first book of his I read was The Terminal Experiment, and I think I've talked about it on the show before, but I mean, it's about a scientist who's trying to scientifically prove the concept of a soul. They're trying to measure different things, like when a person dies and everything, and so like to do this, he like creates these human simulations in a computer program, and then one of them ends up killing someone, and he has to try to figure out who, and it's like it's complicated, but anyway, the whole notion that science fiction would deal with trying to prove the existence of a soul, obviously in the book, there's a lot of stuff that sort of makes someone question whether or not that's actually even feasible. I mean, that probably helped me along that path as well. And actually, a lot of Robert J. Sawyer's books actually do deal with religion in that way, to the extent that I interviewed him once, and I asked him, like if he was like sort of a tortured agnostic, meaning you're somebody who wants to believe but can't because of your scientific knowledge or whatever. But I mean, he turns out he's just an atheist. But I think he finds that notion interesting of playing with religion in a science fictional context.
Mm. Yeah.
And what about you? I mean, you basically grew up with two parents who were scientists, and so no religious upbringing at all, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I usually just tell people that my parents aren't religious, and so I just never had it. But actually, I was thinking about it just in preparation for this episode. It's actually a little more nuanced than that, because my parents, when I was a real little kid, my parents were really reluctant to, sort of pass their beliefs on to me. They sort of wanted me to make up my own mind, and I don't think I asked them particularly often. But I think if I were to ask them, they would just be like, "Well, what do you think?" And so I can remember when I was a real little kid, I thought my parents were religious. I mean, we never went to church, but, just because everybody I knew was religious. I mean, lots of people who are religious don't go to church. And so I just assumed that they had some sort of mild religious beliefs. But I never did. I mean, like I said in an earlier episode, I mean, I was not a strictly rational kid. I mean, I believed in all sorts of stuff I think is silly now, like alien abduction and the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot and stuff like that. but just the idea that my friends and family were kind of telepathically communicating with an invisible man in the sky who was giving them good advice and sort of like granting wishes and stuff. I mean, that just from the time I was 3 years old, I was just like, that can't possibly be true. And I can remember like thinking that I was the only person in the world, who realized that this was all made up, and just how sort of scary and isolating that was. One of the reasons I was drawn to science fiction was because, back before, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett and all this stuff, there really wasn't much atheism in popular culture. And like science fiction always just sort of struck me as this little sort of island of sanity in this just sort of sea of superstition.
Actually, speaking of, just like thinking of this topic in terms of science fiction, I one of the questions I've sort of wondered from time to time is like, would it be possible for us, to actually conceive of a world like in fiction without any religion? Like, could you build a fantasy world, that has humans in it as we understand them, basically, but just like there's no presence of religion at all at any point in their history? Like no one ever thought of the idea of religion. Like, is that actually possible, do you think?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Robert Sawyer. I mean, I haven't read Hominids, but my understanding of it is that it sort of presents part of the book is it presents this alternate world in which Neanderthals evolved into modern humans, and apparently Neanderthals didn't bury their dead. So the speculation is that they had no concept of an afterlife. I don't know if that's still the sort of cutting edge science or not, but that was at least something people were thinking about at some point. And so I think in his book, it presents the sort of evolved Neanderthals as sort of more secular and humanistic, just at a biological level than we are.
Yeah, actually, you're right. Yeah, I mean, I actually did read that series. The Neanderthals, like, because it's like they come from like an alternate universe, basically that crosses over with our universe, and so the Neanderthals that evolved in that world, end up traveling over to ours, and so we're able to sort of get a glimpse of their culture. And yeah, you're right. They did evolve completely without any notion of religion.
Okay, but so then the last thing I kind of wanted to talk about was. In fantasy, in recent years, the most sort of unapologetically atheistic work has been His Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman, starting with The Golden Compass. I don't know, I guess, John, just what did you think about Golden Compass in particular? Did you like it?
Yeah, I actually loved it. And this is kind of on a side note, I listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook is honestly one of the best audiobooks ever. It's read by Philip Pullman, who like it has this amazing deep like narrative voice, and but then it also has a full cast reading all the different characters. So like Pullman reads all the narration, and different people read all the characters, and the person who reads the part of Lyra, who's like the protagonist, is just like perfect. But anyway, but yeah, I mean, I was completely just spellbound by the whole book, and I mean, and sort of, I mean, spoiler alert, I mean, the book sort of leads up to this big revelation at the end that it's like basically what is it exactly? Like they're going off to kill God, or God's dead, or there's some kind of thing about God being dead at the end of it or something, right?
Well, that's in the third book. Yeah. Do you want to?
Oh, okay.
Do you want to just? I guess we gave a spoiler warning. I mean, essentially, what happens at the end is that the characters find God, who's this sort of withered old man who wants to die, and his sort of subordinates are keeping him alive against his will. And also, he is not really the creator of the universe. He was sort of the first angel, as it were, to sort of coalesce out of the cosmic, substance. And he pretended that he had created everything. He lied, but he's sort of this lie is sort of spun out of control, and now he can't get out of the situation that he's created.
but yeah, I mean, just the fact that it was so explicitly atheist was really astonishing. And I mean, and then, I mean, it's really aimed at, it's not even YA. I think it's even aimed at younger readers. So, I mean, I was just really thrilled that such a book exists, and that not only that, but it was popular and it's on recommended reading lists and everything. And I mean, I'm sure there must have been tons of protests against the book when it came out, but yeah, I mean, it's just great that kids now, they'll encounter this sort of randomly, or even through a school reading list, and then maybe that'll get them started questioning things earlier on than maybe we had, or early on than I had been able to, because of the way I grew up.
But I guess that brings us to the movie, though. I mean, what did you see the movie? I mean, what did you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I saw the movie, and God, it's so beautiful. I mean, like, and just seeing Yorick Bjornsson brought to life on screen, like, that was amazing, But I don't know. I mean, it's a big book to try to adapt into a movie, and I don't know how well you could actually follow the thing without having read the book. I mean, because there's a lot of stuff that's taken out, and like it ends before the book ends. It ends significantly before the book ends. I really enjoyed watching it. Watching the characters and everything come to life, but it certainly got a lot of issues. And also because we were talking about how great the audiobook is. I couldn't help but be a little disappointed with the girl who plays Lyra, because like the woman who narrates her voice on the audiobook is so great that like I think it would be really hard for any actual regular actor to live up to that performance in the movie, but I mean, I don't know. I think you had a stronger reaction to it when you saw it, right?
Well, I actually liked it quite a bit. I mean, I saw it in I actually caught a sort of an advanced screening of it when I was in LA, and the crowd seemed to really enjoy it. It subsequently got very mixed reviews. I mean, I think maybe I had a more sort of realistic sense of what you can of what some of the extenuating circumstances were in getting that movie made. Than maybe sort of the general public. I mean, when it was like a $160 million picture or something like that, and just to make, and I think the studio they probably dramatically underestimated how much of a sort of anti-atheist backlash there was going to be against that movie. They were just sort of looking at it as another Lord of the Rings or Narnia. Mm-hmm. Apparently there was, I mean, they did a bunch of stuff to sort of downplay the anti-religious aspects of the story, which was kind of a shame from my point of view. And also, the studio apparently just chopped the hell out of the thing. So the theatrical version, I mean, they chopped out, like you said, they chopped out the ending. They moved stuff around. There was a lot of pressure for it to have a happy ending and to be inoffensive and family friendly. And so, the director has said that he had said that he would like to do a director's cut that he said he estimated would be about 2.5 hours long, which, obvious, because I mean, a big problem with that movie is just how frenetic and rushed and choppy it is. And I think a 2.5 hour version, would maybe fix all of that. But I still think it's quite an enjoyable movie. I mean, I think it's at least as good as like a Harry Potter movie or a Narnia movie, all of which got sequels. And I was really disheartened that they didn't that movie didn't get a sequel, because especially, like as I said, given how controversial, particularly the third movie, I understand would have been, that really would have been something to see. Yeah. Well, and I just think it just kind of depresses me that, whenever there's a boycott against something, generally people are like, well, it doesn't do any good. It actually just brings more publicity to the thing and, ends up benefiting it. But I think this was a case where a boycott, a sort of censorious boycott, clearly succeeded. That the movie did, I think it exceeded expectations in every country except the United States, where it, did much worse than anyone expected because of this boycott, and it just makes me sad. A, that I won't get to see the sequel because of that, and B, just on principle that censorship and just sort of nasty anti-atheist prejudice was successful in this case.
So my new stepdaughter, because I just got married in August, so my wife's daughter is 9, and she's got all these books on her recommended reading list, and she has to read a certain amount of time every day and whatnot. We've actually got a thing right now where she has to read for every hour she reads, she can watch an hour of TV, because otherwise she just sit and watch TV all the time. But so, we were talking about different books and stuff, and I was like, oh, you know what you should look for? You should get The Golden Compass. That's a great book. And she's like, wow, they made a book out of that? I was like, no, it's the other way around. The book came first, and then they made a movie out of that. But yeah, I mean, it's I think that would be a cool thing to get her to read. Obviously, for a lot of the reasons we're, because sort of, and I mean, this is a child that has been raised entirely without any religious upbringing. So, I mean, it would be interesting to see her take on it, just because, like, I mean, I can't imagine that she would think there was anything weird about it at all. About the sort of anti-religious bent to it. So, and also it's just a great story, and it's something that, her mother and I both read and loved. So, I mean, I thought it would be something cool for her to actually read, because we could actually talk about it with her.
All right. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks to Richard Dawkins for joining us on the show. As always, if you want to support the show, you can go to our website and you can make a donation via PayPal, or if you just want to support us for free, you can go to iTunes or your favorite podcast directory and leave us a review or rating. How many reviews are we up to on iTunes, Dave? 72.
We have 72. So we were hoping to get up to 100 by the end of the year. So if you like the show and you love it and you want to help spread the word, go ahead and do that, and either post a review or just give us a rating. And of course, if you tell a friend, that always helps too.
All right. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of IO9. For this episode's show notes, to subscribe to this podcast, or for more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephatadams.com or davidbarkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.